in his State of the Union address, asks for a second Bill of Rights in which he enumerates all these economic rights that he hoped, guaranteed employment, and so on and so forth. Universal health care that he wants eventually to happen, but he knows by that time this is a dead letter. He's not going to get it. He's just laying down a marker for somebody in the future to pick up. But it's not the court packing episode all by itself. It's this resistance to the New Deal, which I think had already reached the limits of what was going to be regarded as legitimate, and then this fear that this guy is becoming very, very powerful. We got to find a way to check him. Linda.
Which New Deal policies were deemed unconstitutional that led to that court packing episode? I noticed the AAA and the NRA. Is it just those?
Yeah, so the question is what policies were in fact found or declared to be unconstitutional by the court. And the Agricultural Adjustment Act and the National Industrial Recovery Act were both tossed out by the court in 1935. They were both measures passed during the so-called 100 days in 1933. The phrase first New Deal and second New Deal has been used here. In my judgment, there really is no, we shouldn't spend much time trying to figure out the difference between first and second New Deal. The 1933 legislation, 100 days, there's 15 pieces of legislation. Only 2 of those pieces of legislation remained on the books after 1943. They really had little or nothing to do with the lasting legacy of the New Deal. The 2 that stay are the Glass-Steagall Act and the TVA legislation. Everything else is gone. AAA and NRA are voided by the court, and CCC disappears, and so on and so forth. I think a better way to understand this is the first impulse of the New Deal, 1933, was to find a way to refloat the economy. They didn't succeed in that. And the longer term objective, what we call the second New Deal, is almost entirely legislated in 1935. That Social Security Act, Federal Reserve Act, Wagner National Labor Relations Act, so on and so forth. The big ones that really create institutions that last, all date from this 1935 period. That's what many people call the second New Deal, but I think that's the heart of the matter for the reasons I was talking about this morning.
Roosevelt's New Deal, what kind of impact did let's say, Huey Long and his share the wealth and the people who had some of the similar ideas have on Roosevelt?
It had some effect. I think we mentioned Alan Brinkley earlier this morning, his book on Huey Long and Father Coughlin. They were the far left. And in politics, you have that pendulum swinging and you have to react to it. And I think, if not legislatively, at least politically, Roosevelt did acknowledge Coughlin, acknowledge Huey Long, Father Townsend, who was calling for old age pensions. Those 3 and others far to the left from him, as well as his wife, moved him in that direction.
But it's an interesting question. It's an interesting question how to categorize Long and Coughlin as left or right. I mean, you could kind of argue it either way.
Well, depending, it's a circle.
Yeah. Wait.
What was the importance of the 27 flood to the political career of Huey P. Long?
Well, we talked about catalytic events, and in this case, it's a catastrophic event. How many of you read Rising Tide? Put it on your list. If you live in Mississippi, you teach history, read Rising Tide. It's not just about the flood. It's about the culture, the economics of the time. It's an absolutely wonderful piece of work, well written. But it gets deep into the Mississippi culture and the politics of the time. The Percy family, Walker Percy's father, who was really the decision maker in Mississippi in responding to the flood. It has some huge racial overtones when the National Guard would go through towns in Mississippi, rounding up all blacks of any socioeconomic category. School teachers were hauled off to the levees and under gunpoint forced to shovel dirt. a huge drama going on. In Louisiana, we were threatened just as much by the flood. Here in New Orleans especially, the river raised to the top of the levees. It rained for 14 straight days at one point. The bankers who run New Orleans were afraid not only of the flood, but more importantly, they were afraid of their reputation in New York and New England, that people would fear for the safety and the economy of New Orleans. So the New Orleans leaders, including the mayor, were under pressure to blow up the levees below New Orleans to release the pressure on the river, to lower the estimations that were that the river would not reach would not breach the levees. But they went ahead and blew up the levees anyway, just as a signal to the northern bankers and that supported the New Orleans economy. Blew up the levees, flooded the several parishes below here, St. Bernard's and Plaquemine Parish, put many people out of their homes, ruined their farms, ruined their businesses. That caused a huge backlash politically, especially the middle and lower classes that were not compensated. They were promised compensation by the state. They never got it. This was in 1927. A year later, Huey Long's running for office. So it's very clear that event had a huge impact upon certainly South Louisiana, and they're just absolutely turned off by the powers that be and looking for a change, and Huey offered them that change.
Just a quick footnote to that, because we're in New Orleans. I spent a lot of time down here after the Katrina, and there were a lot of different community organizations and activist groups that were working around housing reconstruction. And I think politically most of them, or at least most of the ones that I at least went to talk to, went from kind of liberal to left to very far left. And one of the things I remember hearing constantly among community people and people on the left was that the levees had been deliberately blown up here. And that particularly that the lower Ninth, which was the notorious place where the industrial canal failed and an all black neighborhood was washed away, that this had been part of a deliberate effort on the part of authorities, blah, blah, blah. And I don't, that's untrue. I mean, that's simply untrue. I wanted to say to these people, you're being completely paranoid here, but then you remember that they did it once before. So.
That's right.
Mike.
Can I just add to, when Huey Long came to power, was there any particular group in Louisiana that decided any kind of social healing movement out of Louisiana into other states, or was everybody pretty content and the state with her?
Not other than his political opponents that he ran off. One was named Dudley LeBlanc, who was a successful snake oil salesman, and who was opposed Huey politically. Dudley LeBlanc had one of the burial services, which catered to the African American community. At that point, one of the only things she could hope in life was a decent burial, and people would give a nickel to these burial policies. And Dudley made a lot of money off of it and used it to foster his political campaign. He also sold a patent medicine called Hadacol, and he and Huey went after each other. And Dudley was a senator. Huey offered legislation that basically outlawed both. It specified both of Dudley LeBlanc's industries, not in general, but specifically. He ordered them out of the state, and LeBlanc had to move to Texas until Huey died. But I mean, in the legislature, there was a lot of objection. They said, "Governor, we can't just outlaw one person's business." He said, "I'm writing it that way," and they did it. They passed it. As Dudley LeBlanc sat there in the front of the Senate.
I have a question for each
if I had to vote, it'd be 51-49, he did not do it. I've met with his family. They're still researching. His nephew is a prominent doctor in Lafayette who's spent his whole life researching all the medical records and everything, and I've gone through it all. And nothing's conclusive, but there was no bullet, there was no x-ray, no chain of custody. You just had to, it's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but it's the human evidence that tells me that Carl Weiss probably did not do it. The personalities, I mean, that Saturday before he'd taken his family on a picnic.
So who did?
I think it was an accident. I think when he went there to accost Huey on the legislation that was going to put his uncle out of a judgeship, and he waited behind a pillar, and when Huey came around the corner, he stepped out to confront him, and the bodyguards, who had Tommy guns inside of paper bags, they just started shooting, and a ricochet went off the wall and hit Huey. That's why I'd love to see the bullet. Now, Dr. Weiss, the gentleman who called me in the middle of the day, who is still alive and still a practicing physician, his goal is to use new technology to do an x-ray through the vault. Huey is buried in a steel vault in front of the state capitol, but he says the technology is there, and I think he's a radiologist, to see if the bullet is still in him, or if it's still in the casket, and to see what the size of the bullet is, and if it's anything more than a .32, then Carl Weiss did not.
But was Weiss back?
They can't prove it. Of course, the state troopers, they testified that he was, or the guards, not the state troopers. But the gun disappeared. Then in the 1970s, a gun reappeared in the family of a state trooper who had investigated it afterwards. It was one of these stamped sheet metal guns from Austria, and there was no chain of custody. They have it in the museum. In the museum in Louisiana, they say it's the gun that shot Huey. I mean, I could have put that.
All right, and for Professor Kennedy, you mentioned when you were talking about like Social Security and things like that, that had they actually followed through with the initial plan and to actually use maybe more of a government pot as opposed to just the employers and things like that. What countries are you familiar with that use that type of Social Security, and it seems like it works like it's supposed to today?
Yeah, well, to the best of my knowledge, and I don't claim perfect knowledge, but to the best of my knowledge, all the Western European societies that have programs of this sort